Little House on the Prairie is a reminder of when things were simpler for us in our lives those 45 years ago.
For nearly 50 years, one image stayed locked in the minds of television fans everywhere. A girl in braids and a sunbonnet, falling in love with a farmer named Almanzo Wilder, in a story that felt as warm and honest as a Sunday afternoon. But in late 2025, the woman behind that girl finally said something fans never expected. Melissa Gilbert, the actress who once was Laura Ingalls, looked back at her own photographs from that time and used one word to describe how she feels now. Nauseated. Not nostalgic. Not proud. Nauseated. And once you understand why, you may never watch those old episodes of Little House on the Prairie the same way again. To understand why this moment matters, you have to go back to where it all began. Little House on the Prairie told the story of the Ingalls family, a small household living in a wooden farmhouse on the American frontier, getting by with very little money, but an abundance of love. At the emotional center of it all was Laura Ingalls, a curious, strong-willed little girl who grew up in front of the cameras across 9 seasons. She was played by Melissa Gilbert, who was only 9 years old when she won the role. Audiences watched her grow up in real time, week after week, year after year, until she felt less like an actress and more like a member of their own family. Melissa's path to that role did not start on a farm. She was born in Los Angeles on May 8, 1964, and placed for adoption the day she was born. She was adopted less than 24 hours later by comedian and actor Paul Gilbert and his wife, dancer and actress Barbara Crane. Growing up in a household built around show business, Melissa was around sets, auditions, and cameras from the time she could walk. By the age of 7, she was booking commercials, and by 9 she had landed the audition that would define the rest of her life, the role of Laura Ingalls. What sealed that audition was her screen test opposite the show's star and producer, Michael Landon, who played her father, Charles Ingalls. Off camera, Landon became something closer to a real father figure to young Melissa, especially after her adoptive parents divorced and her home life grew complicated. She has spoken for years about how much that relationship meant to her during a childhood that was, in many ways, unstable. The Little House set became a kind of second home, filled with people who looked out for her in a way that not every child actor gets to experience. As Melissa grew older, the show grew with her, and eventually the storyline turned toward Laura falling in love. That meant introducing a new character, Almanzo Wilder, and casting an actor to play him. The role went to Dean Butler, who joined the series in its 6th season. On screen, the chemistry between Laura and Almanzo became one of the most talked about romances in television history. Fans wrote letters. Fans debated whether the two actors were secretly together in real life. For decades, neither Melissa nor Dean said very much about what that experience was actually like behind the scenes, and the silence only made the public more curious. Here is the detail that got lost in all that romantic nostalgia. When Dean Butler was cast as Almanzo, he was 23 years old. Melissa Gilbert was 15. That 8-year age gap meant a grown man was cast opposite a teenage girl, and the show asked them to perform a believable, tender, romantic love story, complete with an on-screen wedding, and eventually, an on-screen kiss that also happened to be Melissa's first real kiss, filmed in front of a camera crew, and, later, millions of viewers at home. For years, both actors spoke about that dynamic carefully, almost gently, framing it as simply part of the job. Dean Butler has said in interviews that he tried to be respectful and professional, aware that his young co-star had far less life experience than he did. He has described her as talented, focused, and brave for stepping into a role that asked so much of her so young. In his 2024 memoir, Prairie Man, Butler wrote about a moment on set that revealed just how uncomfortable the arrangement was for the people who loved Melissa most. He recalled Melissa's mother, Barbara, becoming visibly upset while they filmed a romantic scene together, upset enough that Michael Landon called for the camera to stop rolling. Butler described it as a protective reaction from a mother who could not bear watching her teenage daughter kiss a much older man for the cameras. Melissa has spoken about that same discomfort from her own side. In her memoir, Prairie Tale, she described meeting Dean and being hit with what she called a wave of disappointment, fear, anger, and even nausea all at once, as she realized what she was about to be asked to do. She has said she felt like she looked and carried herself like a child standing next to a grown man, and that she genuinely had no idea how she was going to pull off convincing the world she was falling in love. That is not the story fans imagined while they were watching Laura and Almanzo hold hands in a wheat field. For a long time, that was more or less where the story stayed, tucked into memoirs, mentioned in passing during interviews, treated as an interesting footnote to a beloved show rather than something worth examining closely. Then, in November of 2025, everything shifted. A wave of women across social media began sharing photos of themselves at age 15, using hashtags like "I was 15" and "I was a child," as a way of pushing back against comments made by a television host who had questioned whether a well-known convicted sex offender could really be considered a predator for pursuing girls that age. It was in that climate that Melissa Gilbert decided to speak. She posted a series of photographs of herself at 15, including images from her time on Little House on the Prairie. In her caption, she said she had debated posting it, but felt she had to. She wrote that after seeing so many other women share their own photos under those same hashtags, she searched her own name and looked back at herself at that age. What she found, in her own words, made her feel actually nauseated. She pointed directly at the fact that the same girl seen smiling on a family vacation was also the girl expected to convincingly fall in love with and kiss a man significantly older than she was on camera for a national television audience. Looking back at it now, she said, "It feels shocking." She repeated it plainly, almost like she needed people to sit with it. "I was a child. I was 15. She also made a point of expressing gratitude toward the adults who did try to protect her at the time, saying she was thankful her mother and Michael Landon were there to help keep her safe throughout that period. This was not a scandalous confession about a secret affair. It was something more grounded and, in a lot of ways, more powerful. It was a woman in her 60s looking back at an industry that asked a 15-year-old to perform adult romance for entertainment, and naming that discomfort out loud, on the record, for the first time in such a direct way. Dean Butler responded not long after, during an episode of the Little House on the Prairie 50th Anniversary podcast in December of 2025. Sitting alongside former co-star Allison Arngrim, who played Nellie Olson, Butler was asked directly how he felt about the age gap between himself and Melissa all those years ago. He did not brush it off. He acknowledged that the difference between a 23-year-old man and a 15-year-old girl was, in his words, a big deal, even if today an 8-year gap between two adults in their 60s barely registers as unusual. He talked about how little life experience Melissa had at that point compared to him, noting that she was, in his description, still very much a little girl in terms of real-world experience, even though she was already a highly skilled young actress. He also gave credit to how much courage it took for her to step into those scenes at all, describing it as something Michael Landon asked of her and something she committed to fully despite how hard it clearly was. What stands out looking at both of their accounts side by side is that neither of them is describing some hidden real-life romance. If anything, they are describing the opposite. This was never two people secretly in love behind the cameras. It was two performers, one of them a legal adult and one of them a minor, asked by a network and a production to sell a fictional love story to millions of households, using techniques and expectations that would almost certainly not fly on a modern set. The chemistry fans fell in love with for decades was, by both of their own accounts, careful professional acting, built under the supervision of people trying to protect a teenager who had been placed in an extraordinarily adult situation. To really understand why Melissa's 2025 statement carried so much weight, it helps to look at what her life actually looked like once the cameras stopped rolling each day. While other teenagers were going to school, hanging out with friends, and having normal adolescent experiences, Melissa was memorizing pages of dialogue, hitting emotional marks on command, and being watched by an audience that expected her to embody a wholesome, cheerful ideal at all times. Strangers treated her like she was Laura Ingalls in real life, not a teenage girl still figuring out who she actually was. That blurring between character and person left her, by her own account, wrestling with basic questions about her own identity well into her teenage years. Her 20s and 30s continued to be shaped by the pressures of an industry that rewarded a very specific look. After Little House ended, Melissa took a lead role in a 1981 remake of Splendor in the Grass, a project that asked her to shed the wholesome Prairie image completely and step into something far more adult and glamorous. She has spoken about how uncomfortable the transformation felt, how tightly controlled every detail of her appearance became, and how quickly the public began commenting on her looks in a way that hadn't happened when she was simply Laura Ingalls. At 18, under that pressure, she underwent a nose job, a decision she later described in her memoir as something that sounded simple on paper, but came with real physical pain and multiple follow-up surgeries to correct complications from the first procedure. Years later, she also had breast implants placed, another decision she has connected directly to the beauty standards she felt pressed into as a young actress trying to survive in Hollywood. What makes Melissa's story stand apart from a lot of former child stars is what she did with all of that later in life. In 2015, she had her breast implants removed and stopped dyeing her hair, telling People magazine it was one of the smartest choices she had ever made. In interviews since then, she has become an outspoken critic of the anti-aging industry itself, arguing that aging should be treated as a privilege rather than something to be corrected or hidden. She has talked about wanting to keep every line on her face because those lines are part of who she is. Her personal life after Little House was full and, at times, turbulent. She dated actor Rob Lowe during her teenage years, a relationship many fans have pointed to as a real adolescent romance, in contrast to the fictional one she was performing on screen with Dean Butler. She later married actor Bo Brinkman, with whom she had a son named Dakota, before that marriage ended in divorce. She went on to marry actor Bruce Boxleitner, gaining 2 stepsons and years of blended family experience before that marriage also ended. In her memoir Prairie Tale, she wrote candidly about struggling with alcohol, about failed cosmetic procedures, and about periods where she genuinely did not recognize herself. That kind of honesty, rare for someone who spent her childhood being watched by millions, is part of why so many fans have stayed loyal to her decades after the show ended. Melissa also built a career well beyond acting. She served as president of the Screen Actors Guild from 2001 to 2005, taking on a leadership role representing thousands of performers across the industry. In 2016, she ran for Congress in Michigan's 8th District, eventually stepping back from the race due to health concerns. But the campaign reflected a version of Melissa the public had not seen much of before, someone willing to step directly into political life rather than simply comment on it from a distance. She continued acting in television movies, theater, and voice work over the years, refusing to let herself be defined only by the braids and sunbonnet audiences remembered from childhood. More recently, she has focused heavily on writing. Her memoir Prairie Tale gave readers an unusually candid look at her life inside and outside the spotlight. Her follow-up memoir, Back to the Prairie, published in 2022, told the story of her move to a small home in the countryside, where she and her husband grow their own food, raise chickens, and live a noticeably slower and quieter life than the one Hollywood once demanded of her. She has used that platform to speak openly about mental health, body image, and the long-term effects of growing up as a child performer, encouraging young women in particular not to chase an impossible standard of perfection. Which brings the story back to where it started. When Melissa Gilbert posted those photos of herself at 15 in November of 2025, she was not doing it for attention, and she was not revealing some scandalous secret about Dean Butler that fans had spent decades guessing at. She was doing something arguably more meaningful. She was using her own platform, built by an industry that once asked a child to perform adult romance on camera, to say clearly and publicly that looking back, it does not sit right with her. She was naming the discomfort that both she and Dean Butler had only ever hinted at in memoirs and passing interview answers. And Dean Butler, to his credit, did not dismiss it. He agreed that the age gap mattered, that it was a big deal at the time, even if the show, the network, and the culture around it treated it as perfectly normal. There was never a secret romance between Laura and Al Manzo waiting to be uncovered. What there actually was is arguably more important. 2 people who, decades later, are willing to be honest about how strange and uncomfortable that arrangement really was, and a former child star using her voice to push back on the idea that any of it should be looked back on with simple nostalgia. That, more than any imagined off-screen love affair, is the real story Melissa Gilbert finally chose to tell.